but I'm just going to introduce our speakers. We've got Jane in the car on the way to Harrogate.
Hi there.
Dialing in from the car, which I think is fabulously 21st century. We have Nika from holiday in Dorset. And we have Kerry from, where are you, Kerry?
I'm in the UK. I usually live in New York, but I'm stuck in the UK and very happy to be stuck home at the moment, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about in a bit.
Right, and I'm in North London as usual. Yeah, it's basically, my life is quite small at the moment, but I'm also going on a holiday next month, which I'm looking forward to France. So this event, thank you to our speakers who are going to speak. I think it's a really interesting idea for us to progress, because we do a Power of Influence series, and that really started from us looking at, there's been obviously with influencers and with social media, there's so many people who have worked really hard, it's not to denigrate what they've done, to become a style icon or an influencer, which is, you know, the latest job opportunity for lots of people, but it's really boring content, and it's basically adverts that are then commercialized because they're worn by the person in their own life, and you don't quite know whether you're looking at an ad or it's authentic, and you don't quite understand what's going on with it. And we all, you know, we look at Instagram and social media for lots of things, whether it's news or aspiration or ideas about paint colors. I know I was this week. Or any number of different reasons that we're looking at it. And obviously we've seen Labour Behind the Label, who were on the all-party parliamentary group evidence session yesterday, have used it really well to highlight the issues in Leicester. But with lots of these influencers, my point is, well, you've got to the equivalent of the front row, you've got there, but what are you actually doing with it? I don't know what you're doing with it, other than trying to get more money to sell us more jeans that we don't really need. And I think what's interesting about all three of our speakers is that all of you have been successful in business. I mean, it's tough for women anyway in business, and it's tough to be in the fashion industry and survive. And you've all managed to, you know, I know you worked in the city, Nika, before, didn't you? Is that right? You were.
Yeah, I did management consultancy.
Yeah. And Jane's been in the industry in various incarnations, very well-known businesses and retailers. And Kerry, you were in events, weren't you, before you started your partnership with the UN? And all of you have taken a decision to resonate with your sustainable values, and those have clearly got more important to you. And I just wanted to open up the conversation about where that arc is. I mean, having been on that evidence session, which will be part of our policy paper for the Ethics and Sustainability APPG, I do know that nobody, once you know this stuff about what is really going on with the conditions of the workers and the lack of value being put on the clothes and the consequences of our fast fashion choices, can stay the same as they were before. I think it's very difficult to unlearn knowledge. And Jane, I just wanted to start with you, if that's okay, because I know you're in the car, you've got good reception at the moment, and also because I remember you from when I was starting out, when I was a fashion assistant, and I think I met you a long time ago, when, that's somebody who keeps ringing me, sorry. I think, did you work at the clothes show, Jane?
No, I didn't work at the clothes show. No.
Okay, so I thought that you were okay, but you've been at Arcadia Group, you've been at Whistles, and now a wardrobe, which is a really interesting development. And could you just talk a bit about the background and then
sure,
wardrobe?
Yeah. I mean, I was at Topshop for a very long time as brand director, but I was actually there for about 20 years, I really loved it. I love fashion. I make no bones about that. And I really enjoyed the time I was there, more than anything, because I enjoy fashion. I wanted to get the very, very best fashion that I could out to people who couldn't afford to buy luxury and designer fashion. I didn't start out wanting to do fast fashion, if you like. And so lots of people sort of say to me, oh, you invented fast fashion. I certainly didn't invent fast fashion, but I don't deny that Topshop certainly could be described as that, although it didn't actually feel that fast in those days. I did enjoy it very much, and but one of the things I found very difficult, certainly towards the end of the time that I was at Topshop, was that it's very hard to change an enormous beast like Topshop. You know, to make that business sustainable, also because it's part of a huge group of stores. It's extraordinarily difficult. You have to kind of break it down into very, very small steps and say, right, well, this I can address, or this I can address. This is something I can do something about. But actually, I can't do anything about the rest of it. So I'm going to kind of almost put that on hold for the time being. That's part of the reason that I left. I mean, the other part obviously was Philip Green. I mean, you know, one couldn't really work for someone like that for any long period of time. But one of the reasons that I left as well was because I wanted to try to work in a smaller business and see if it were possible to take a smaller business and then actually make those changes that you know, made it into something that you could be proud of. So in between leaving Topshop actually and starting Whistles, I worked with Safia Mini as a non-exec director at People Tree for a year, or no, actually more than that, probably about 3 or 4 years, to try to sort of get to the bottom of, because she came at it from completely the other angle. You know, she was a real pioneer in the fair trade space. So I kind of thought, well, if I can learn that end of it, and I already know the other end of it, then maybe I can put the two together in some way. It wasn't that easy, I have to say. You know, it's whatever you are doing as a business that is already established. So even one the size of Whistles, you can never actually be sure. All you can ever say is, I know what I'm doing. I think I'm doing as much as I can do, but it's not enough. And you know, and I was kind of well aware it wasn't enough. I left Whistles really more than anything because I wanted to try and find a different way of doing things. And it was also becoming more and more clear. And I think perhaps sort of 6 or 7 years ago, it wasn't actually that the environmental impact of fashion wasn't as well known as it is today, I think, even for people like myself who are in the industry. I knew that we shouldn't buy cotton from Uzbekistan because it used up all the water, but I didn't know quite how damaging it was. And that was something that I kind of found out in the year out that I took. And when I came back, I wanted to, you know, to use the experience and influence that I have got, not to make amends for all this bad stuff that I've done, but to try and sort of perhaps change people's behavior, perhaps to find something that allows people to enjoy fashion as much as I'd love them to enjoy it, but in a way that is not damaging the planet and is not sort of creating these terrible working conditions for people. So yeah, so I ended up in rental.
So I worked with a rental company that launched in Paris a few years ago, called Panoply.
Yes.
And I consulted for them and worked on their launch. And I think that I told them to launch here first, which they chose not to because of Brexit. And then I told them to launch earlier here than they chose to, again, because of Brexit. Because they were both French women, although one of them lives here most of the week. And I know that, you know, that they did do great edit, don't get me wrong. They chose well, they bought well.
Yeah, I thought it looked amazing.
It does, and it did, and it's 10 parts of the issue is trying to get the brands behind you. Yes. What I knew from them was it was very difficult for them to educate the designers and the ateliers and the sales agents that this was going to be a rental, because they're so used to trying to sell 20 and to try and sell maybe 3 to a rental company. Obviously, what the asset of you joining is that you're so well known in the industry, Jane, is that you know, a lot of these rental companies have come at it from a different perspective and maybe haven't got the embedded connections that you've got.
Sorry, hang on.
And she's on the M1 and she's coming.
Sorry, hang on a minute.
I love that you're doing this from the car.
Sorry, I just lost you completely. I went silent for some.
Yeah, don't worry. Thank you, Jane. And I really appreciate you doing this from the car. It's very kind of you.
Not at all.
I love it. I've done it too, but I know how it feels. So thank you. How difficult did you find it to work with the sales agents on them selling to a rental platform. If you want, I can put the question in the chat and I can come back to you, Jane. How does that sound? Should we do that? Let's do that. So I'm just going to type my question, Jane, and we will move on to somebody else while she's in bad reception. So Nika, I'll come to you because you're on holiday as well. You just talk a bit about your more corporate side and then how you've gone into working and what you're doing with the, I mean, I'm sure lots of people know the story, but you're working with the last London leather manufacturers, aren't you? And you've chosen that, but if you could just explore that, that would be great.
Yeah, so corporate side, basically, I studied Masters in Business Psychology, and from that I always knew I wanted to set up a brand, but one that does social good, makes an impact, but I didn't know exactly what. So as a graduate, I just fell into the corporate world, and I guess there's a similar likeness to the fashion industry now, but it was so rigid. It was so there was a hierarchy. It was so difficult to make an impact, and I was getting very frustrated with the creative skills I had, that they weren't really used, essentially, and you just had to follow the rule book. And so at that same time, I live in East London. I was reading about how East London was a huge manufacturing textile area, and it was completely basically non-existent 30, 40 years later. So it was booming around 60s, 70s, and then by the 90s, noughties, it just didn't exist, because a lot of UK brands wanted to use cheap labor abroad to manufacture their brands. So
yeah, so my cousin had a leather manufacturers in East London called Fuad, and he made for Burberry, Reese, Nicole.
Oh, really?
And in 1 year, in the noughties, they all went to China, and yeah. So it was opposite the mosque in Whitechapel, and it had grown and grown, and he'd done really well. And now he's like, well, I know he's tried restaurants and it hasn't really worked either. He's had a run of bad luck, and it's not down to a lack of skills. When all his workers were Bangladeshi, and all those skills therefore are lost. So what you do?
So that's just one example of the impact of moving an industry completely abroad. And this industry in East London, built a community, built a skill set. I mean, like, I don't think anyone realizes an impact of moving an industry out of an area. They're just like, oh, okay, so it's made here, it's made there. But actually, for East London, this was so many people's livelihoods. It impacted its basically separated communities, separated families, because skilled workers had to look out of the area, maybe Northampton, to use their leather manufacturing skills. And also with that, it was kind of a depreciation of British craftsmanship, because it doesn't really exist anymore. And I mean, this all came later, but when I was reading about it, I was just like, how bizarre that you call yourself London brand and you don't make in London. I just couldn't get my head around it. And then when I started looking into it more and more, and when I heard that, how it's impacted families, impacted communities I mean, your cousin, it happened within a year. That's just one example, but there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of families impacted this way, and it happened over a 10-year period, which is just still very, very short. And then with that, I also, living in the area, saw that there's been like kind of resurgence of designers and artists like Erdem and Molly Golo, and I don't know where they're manufactured, but I know that most do not manufacture in East London. And I feel like there is a kind of a disparity between celebrating these designers from East London, but not, you know, and then just kind of ignoring the operation manufacturing process. And with Paradise Row, I was just so inspired by the history of leather goods that I was like, well, I want it to be one of the main ones, which I think it's just only small brands that are manufacturing in East London at the moment, to inspire other brands that to make locally, and how much it benefits the community in the area, and also just brings light to your customers of how much their purchase makes an impact. And yeah, I just, it's an uphill struggle, but I think I'm really proud of where Paradise Row is at after 3 years. I think it's starting to really make some movement and starting to inspire other brands about making locally.
Well, also you're pre-COVID, but obviously COVID has highlighted the consequences of longer supply chains.
Yeah,
because you're on the same time zone, it's up the road for your factory, you can communicate with them. Have you seen have you seen the benefits of that in terms of the COVID impacts as well?
Yes, I feel like it's a lot more manageable, but the COVID impact has made it's really tough, because these workshops really rely on every single business they get. Yeah. And so at the moment, the workshop I'm working with, they are closing on and off depending on the work they get in. So I'm like, can you manufacture this week? They're like, no, we don't have enough business coming in, we're closing, and all our employees are on furlough. And next week, and then the following week they're open, and then the following week they're closed. So it's a bit crazy, and I think they're on that teetering edge of hopefully not closing permanently.
Right.
But something like a huge pandemic like this makes the most vulnerable of workshops and factories just, you know, to a point where they can't manage that below.
And what have you heard from the retailers in terms of them understanding that, you know, you're working in London, and the story and the authenticity of your business? Because I think it's brilliant the way that you market it, and the way that even I bought one of the well, you said it was a second, it looked perfect to me, but it supported charity, one of your bags recently that supported, I think, what was it? The
London Buddhist Centre is the one that,
yes,
yeah, 100% of your purchase contributed to London Buddhist Centre.
I mean, they also would have had a crisis because they're essentially an events location, even though it's for prayer.
Yeah, I think with that campaign is that we had several seconds. You know, it was a loss to the business anyway, so what's the point of it sitting on a shelf there? Might as well do some good with it. And that's where charities are the most vulnerable, and also these kind of community establishments around East London, they make what East London is, and so it's very important to just give them a helping hand during this crisis. Going back to your retailer question, I find it very difficult with retailers, because they obviously, from my perspective, my own experience, I feel like they do take advantage of small brands because they can. All of them, nearly all of them, are saying, can you do sales on return basis? No one wants to really invest in wholesale anymore. Right. And I'm like, I cannot do that because I need the cash flow to pay these workshops. So if you're doing kind of if they're proposing a sales and return basis, I basically have to put a lot of my own money into stock, and it's just sitting there, and it really puts the business in a compromising position. So how are we ever going to make this kind of change where we're like supporting our workshops and our factories, where wholesalers are not going to, you know, buy on a wholesale basis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with sell or return, and it just seems to be the growing trend. And it's very similar to what we've heard during the COVID crisis about the non-payment to the manufacturers, both here and overseas. It's the same mentality, isn't it? It's the same. Well, the risk's on you, not on us. How do you sell? Lastly, before I go to Jane, because I'm sure she's got some thoughts on this and what we can pick up now. She's got reception back. Do you think that that your own sales through your own platforms is a growing market for you? So selling through Paradise Row.
This is where, because it seems like for me, department stores are just not reliable anymore, and I feel, you know, you work so hard and they still give you just like an inch. I don't know what is it, all the feedback I get is the decisions are driven by not what's new and contemporary and up and coming. It's what sells the most, and then what sells the most are the brands that already have that huge market and have the huge ad budgets and so on. So it's kind of a catch-22. I think personally these department stores, probably most of them have left it too late to be a bit more agile and seen as a kind of 360 experience of online and store. And so that's why they're like putting the risk back onto brands. But yeah, I think because the attitude at the moment, even pre-COVID, I think the ways to go is to e-commerce to really survive as a small brand, which is a shame, because I feel like department stores more than anything need that kind of diversity and to be interesting and have a mix of brands rather than the same old big corporate brands to survive. So yeah.
I mean, definitely, if you're looking at an exciting shopping experience, you want a blend of the two. You want the names that resonate with people, but you also want the ones that will excite them. Tatum's got a question for you. I actually thought, Tatum, when you signed up that you were a relative of Nika's. I thought, oh, maybe her mum just signed up. So if you could just reply to her in the chat, because while Jane's got reception, back to the questions. And I mean, you know, you understand about blending those brands, Jane, about how to make that experience exciting. And I do think it must be very challenging for the retailers, increasingly so. But I wonder what your thoughts on that were before we pick up on the hiring kind of conversation that we were having before.
Yeah. I you know what? I hear this story so often about the big department stores just not taking any risks at all. Everything's on sale or return. They treat everybody extremely badly. In my opinion, the only reason that you would go to a big department store like a Selfridges, for example, is as a marketing showcase. That's the only reason, except the fact you won't make any money out of it, and you'll probably lose a little bit of money. You'll get yourself in front of an enormous audience, but that's the only reason that I would ever do it. It's such a shame, but it is the case. And in fact, Selfridges actually have an enormous sustainability department. You know, they apparently take it very seriously that they want Selfridges to showcase the newest and the most sustainable brands. So I would have thought that your brand would be perfect for them. But
thank you. Well,
sorry, go on.
Sorry, go on. Sorry to interrupt you. Go on.
No, I think they're just so wound up in the narrative of the brand being, you know, so kind of innovative and new and exciting, that if it doesn't sort of tick all of their boxes, that, I don't know, they're not interested. So it's a tough one.
My experiences, and this is just an example with my meeting with them, is they were saying that they have this whole sustainability initiative that they're doing and so on. And you know, Paradise Row fits with that. And they said, so what is your new collection for autumn winter 20? And I'm like, well, my brand is not about that. It's not seasonal. The collections are add-on collections. So I'm not bringing a new collection for this autumn winter. Like, it's once a year collection, and it's an add-on, and they, you know, that these collections are here to stay. And then they were like, well, that doesn't really fit with our model. Our business model is all about newness. And I was like, but this completely contradicts the kind of sustainability initiative that you have. So that, you know, talk about catch-22, I feel like department stores really need to be in on this conversation we're having, and they're just not, they're not involving themselves in it.
I know. There is so much that needs to change.
Also, the Westerns are on the list that we've shared from Tradecraft with people who haven't paid yet. I mean, there's been something from Tradecraft that we shared. It might be not the list. I don't know. Actually, Heather, could you look for it and share that quiz, because I could have got that wrong. I mean, Nika, I know you're sleep deprived with having a baby, but let me tell you, it goes on. I'm so sorry to break it to you. And I'm 9 years in and I'm still suffering. So Heather, if you could just look for that quiz and share it, because I might have got that wrong. Right, the hire business and the and educating the sales agents. How do you feel that's gone for My Wardrobe?
Well, it's fascinating, I think. In fact, I only joined My Wardrobe back in October. I mean, it feels like I've been there forever, but it was only back in October. And so much has changed. So much had already changed pre-COVID. Because when I started, we were literally going to brands and prostrating ourselves in front of them and basically saying, you know, we'll do anything. Please, 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 please. You've got to come out. This is the new way. You know, everyone's going to love it and what have you. We then had the British Fashion Awards, where we managed to get 70 influencers dressed in My Wardrobe. We've gone all out in terms of PR. I mean, I can't count the number of interviews that we've done with you know, anybody and everybody, just to get the word out there. And it got to the stage in January where brands had started to come to us. Okay. And brands that we really wanted, brands that we thought were really cool. I was also starting to have some conversations with young up-and-coming designers and some more established designers, but London designers, who were basically saying, we had the conversation, well, why don't you start to create a collection just for rental? You know, or either as a part of your total collection, or just create a collection for rental. I mean, it seems to me that if you're going to sell it to wholesale, you only get a third of the selling price. If you rent it, we rent at 10% of the RRP. We take obviously a small commission based on that. But, you know, the designer, after they've rented 3 or 4 times, they've got the same amount of money back as they have through selling at wholesale. So we were having these conversations. Everything was going incredibly well. You know, the awareness was rising continually. Everyone was saying, oh my God, you know, this is the next big thing. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Sorry, I lost you for a minute. And then COVID struck. And unfortunately, I mean, the big thing that rental is dependent upon is events. You know, it's large groups of people getting together and having a really good time, which of course is just not happening at the moment. I'm delighted to hear that weddings of 30 people are now allowed to go ahead, but I think it's going to be a while. I think a lot of people will decide to wait until next year. So you know what, there's absolutely nothing we can do. We hear that in this period of sort of reflection that we've all had, that, you know, where we haven't been buying things and we've all been detoxifying our wardrobes and this sort of thing, that people what we hear anecdotally is that people are now making much more considered choices for their own wardrobe, you know, buying things that will last them, that will go with other things, they're mending them, and etc. And that they're looking to rental for exciting kind of, you know, pieces for events. This is what I hear. I don't know. To be honest with you, we're kind of, you know, passing the time by doing all of the sort of the massive to-do list of tech that everybody has. And as soon as events start properly, you know, we'll sort of get ourselves going again. That's the odd few people renting something for a Zoom meeting, but I
dressed up for Zoom. I've still got my leg weights on because leg weights.
Oh, I love you. I love you.
The theme of lockdown, I got through 2 sets. And that's it. I literally dress up for Zoom. This is the level of excitement I'm experiencing, and I'm interviewing people in Bangladesh or in a car park.
Brilliant, brilliant. Good for you. I'm glad somebody's kept their standards high.
Well, you know what? I've got to keep the love alive, Jane. I really have.
Yeah.
I've basically worn gym clothes every single day.
Oh, God.
I can dress up for something. I at least feel I've got a little bit of my old life back.
Me too.
I have a question for Jane.
Brilliant.
So, yes.
Jane, you said that influencers, that whole marketing campaign you had, and I remember it. You did it with the fashion awards as well.
Yes.
And you said that's just really made the biggest impact, and brands started coming to you. You don't think, is there at the moment, do you think that is the kind of the main impact now is influencers? You can't see any other?
No, I don't actually. I don't. I can't. I kind of use that example because it was perhaps the biggest thing that we did, and that we managed to get so many people together, all wearing rentals. So it just visually made a huge impact, both on the day but also don't forget it was an industry event. You know, the British Fashion Awards. So many of the designers and the brands that we were talking to were actually there, saw the publicity because of course they were looking for their own kind of publicity, and so I think it was a kind of a well-chosen event. The people that we dressed, you know, I call them influencers. Half of them were influencers, half of them were just kind of, you know, girls that look good in dresses. So but I think it's all about like a continual, you know, bashing away at this sort of thing. You know, we did the British Fashion Awards, and then I think every week after that, we were literally on all the newspapers, all of the online magazines, just constantly saying, yeah, okay, we'll do this. Any kind of award ceremonies, any kind of judging. I literally prostituted myself to find people to tell the story to, because once you tell the story, it's very compelling, as is your story. It is just about that kind of continual really putting yourself out there.
It's just I thought that, you know, if influence for the moment seemed to have the most impact, especially, you know, for my wardrobe HQ, I was just thinking that they need to have a bit more of a sense of a responsibility now, that they are, you know, now they're playing the game, they need to also accept the responsibility as you mentioned before, Tamara, that it's not just about ad and selling, and it's they need to know that their actions has consequences. So I just found it interesting that if they made such an impact and such a buzz and such a noise, that they also need to be held to account on other things that they're doing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually. I've had quite a few influencers who have sort of contacted me and said, oh, you know, I don't know, I've followed your career or whatever. It'd be really nice to just do something together. And then I kind of explain that, well, if you want to do something with us, then you have to really believe that this is something we all should be doing. And as likely as not, they just kind of disappear. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I think it's a tricky one because I think there's lots of. I do get it. It's an aspirational. It's a bit like, I don't know, winning the X Factor was 10 years ago. Being a stylist was 20 years ago. Being a footballer seems to be for every boy I know. Yeah, and I don't think it gets any. I think it's you know, but it's a question of what we're doing with that agency and with that voice. And there are people who are definitely using it to create platforms to discuss things, and I think that's to be commended. But also, it's not easy for everybody, and they have to work out the dynamics, I guess, and the problematics. But at least if we're starting those conversations, and I would imagine that even those people, although they're probably living in a nice house during lockdown with lots of food and, you know, endless Ocado visits, and you know, they're not living the shared, you know, COVID, if anything has not been democratic, is that it has probably made them all think. It will have made them think about health, about well-being, and about, you know, what they're going to do with the next phase. And possibly their managers are also talking to them about being more accountable and about being more.
Yes, I definitely see that. I mean, I don't know if you know about the Copenhagen influencer tax.
No.
So in Copenhagen, if you're an influencer...
Humbly cry, by the way, Nika. I know that cry very well. Fully expecting you to start breastfeeding on camera.
I'd bring him on camera, but he's a bit grizzly. But yeah, Copenhagen has this tax, introduced this tax for influencers, basically, that if you get a gift, you have to pay tax on it. So immediately this has reduced wastage, because they're not just accepting gifts for the hell of it. They're actually considering, do I need this? Do I want this? I have to pay tax. I have to actually pay for it if I really want it. And then that removes the kind of taking advantages of brands, smaller brands especially, which they don't have marketing budgets, and this kind of consumerism for like fast fashion. It just completely eliminates it. And well, not completely, but you know what I mean, it reduces it. And it's just I think it's a much better system, and it makes them more accountable as well, and maybe more authentic in what they believe in and so on.
That's a brilliant idea. I wanted to just bring in Kerry, because we've had a few questions about non-payment, and actually also like Jane, you've obviously got a world of events that you normally do. So first of all, the non-payment issue isn't just rife in overseas. As we know from Labour Behind the Label, and we heard yesterday at the APPG meeting, it's endemic. It's in Leicester, it's in London, it's everywhere. Could you just highlight, because your background is events, Kerry, how did you pivot into working with the UN, which is about as big school as it gets, I think, in terms of partnerships?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the UK. I moved out to New York 17 years ago when I was 21, and decided I was going to take on big city and try some cool new things. And I actually thought I was going to go there for 6 months, and as I said, 17 years later, I was still there until recently. And I was always drawn to the power of convening. And like Jane said, events bring us together. We create memories with events, and now having rental also now brings a fashion element that we can borrow and create memories more with that. But I was doing B2B, so I was building opportunities during New York Fashion Week for independent brands to show domestically and international brands to make into the US market. I think for this crowd, maybe similar to something like On Off at the time, Fashion Scout, that might be similar for everyone to understand. There wasn't anything like that in the US. They don't have support for the creatives to build them up and showcase them and just really empower the talent in the fashion space, especially at that time. So at 23 years old, I started my own production house for showcasing, as I mentioned, independent fashion brands. And for myself, I had always been very involved in give back. And I think when you look back over the 15 years of my career doing that, it's had very different definitions. So when it was ethical fashion, people would be like, why are you putting that on the runway? The palette's awful, the cut is unappealing, there's no story behind it. And I'm like, yes, but this family made it, and it's an artisan craft. And people just used to look at me like, oh, this poor girl. And even I remember about 14 years ago, I did something through New York Fashion Week called the Ethical Fashion Preview. And we brought over about 35 independent, international, made local, at that time classed very ethical and fair trade. And we brought them over to New York Fashion Week, and the editors were horrified. Don't get me wrong, you had people that personally resonated and wanted to support, but for their jobs, they were like, we cannot put ethical brands in our blogs, in the magazines. And so I found myself then almost doing all my give back, my sustainability work out of hours and on the side. And for any entrepreneurs, we don't even have any out of hours really as it is. But I found sustainability back then was doing a fundraiser, even with what would be classed now as a fast fashion brand, but then taking the profits to benefit a cause. And that was a little bit more acceptable then. We weren't in the depths of understanding the damage we were doing to people and planet. And so in my own little bubble, I was making what I could change and saying to people, if you looked at this manufacturing, or if you looked at this, and then you fast forward, 8 years or so into the business, and the platform had really grown. And I remember just standing there during show production in the tech box and my headset on, ready to call the show. 400, 500 people in the space in New York, all their phones out, everything was all the rage, like just show it all. And I remember just thinking, we're about to promote this brand and connect it to retailers, potential investors, stylists. They're going to put them on celebrities. And I keep saying to them, you're sellable, you're scalable, your brand is beautiful. But it always just kind of bugged me that we weren't asking enough questions. Who makes your clothing? How do you pay them? How do you dispose of the waste? And so when people around me used to be like, just stop, like, this isn't what you do. Like, stop asking these questions and let's go to the after party, or look at the beautiful clothing you're wearing. What does it matter? And it became a personal thing. And like anybody that may be in sustainability on this call, I started doing research and I went down the rabbit hole and I never kind of came back out of just understanding just what the hell we are doing, never mind to our planet, to our local surroundings, our local people. We talk about these reports about Leicester, that is so close to home for so many of us. And this has been going on for a long time, and it shouldn't have taken where we are today for this to come to light and maybe even be taken seriously, even if it is being taken seriously enough amongst those in the space. And so I found myself on this journey. I have a lot of friends in the political scene and government out in the US, and they started to see what I was up to and be like, come to this event, come to this. And I think it was also a novelty for people to have, and my friend works in fashion, when they were the government side. I think I spiced things up a little bit when I would go to these sessions with people. And I just started learning so much and realizing how separate the worlds are of institutes, academics, and then the companies on the ground that are left with the decisions to build up our economies. They're hiring, they're sourcing. I mean, the list goes on, as we all know. And I just think very well for myself, my worlds were able to be bridged. And the United Nations saw my background in events as I was coming in to consult and help. I got asked to then help and lead a lot more initiatives within the UN in the event space as they were starting to move forward and realizing they wanted to speak to beyond the gates. What were corporates doing? What was civil society doing? And especially for anyone here familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, when they were adopted and came out in 2015, that was really when the United Nations realized they had to talk to everyday people, the entrepreneurs, the NGOs, the businesses across all sectors. And I think when people were looking to connect with the event space and the fashion space, I was probably one of these people with this bridge that wasn't very unique at that time. And so I got very involved then on the UN side of things with event partnerships and helping companies like CBS and Google and so forth kind of bridge the gap when they were launching impact projects to work directly with the United Nations so they could make more impact together versus working separately on the exact same thing. And then a couple of years ago, I started saying to the UN, I don't understand why you do not connect further with the fashion industry. And they were like, well, they've got their stuff over here and it's so big. And a couple of people would say to me, the fashion industry is rather intimidating. I'm like, well, you're the United Nations, you're probably a little intimidating to the fashion industry too, but there has to be ways to connect, because the fashion industry was constantly in reports that I was hearing about or reading that were coming out of the UN different bodies about the pollution, what was going on with hiring and trade and financials and labor organizations. I said, you know, you're talking huge numbers here, whether it's financial to employees to then just water output and waste. You have to connect, because if the United Nations can help people understand this framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a blueprint and an existing framework to step forward towards having a better planet and a better working life for people, then the two powerful entities could make so much change together. And you could turn those numbers when you look at the millions being hired. What if those millions were now being hired fairly and treated well, because the fashion industry was being educated more so by maybe an institute that they would respect, versus people sharing stats and fighting the good fight and not being heard. And so very quickly, we created the Conscious Fashion campaign, more as a hub or a platform to bridge and bring the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals more to the forefront. And through that, I decided to go maybe a non-traditional way and revert back to my history of event experience, and decided that pushing the campaign through the leading fashion industry event platforms would be a really interesting way to connect with the stakeholders. So the Conscious Fashion campaign partners with fashion weeks, the trade shows, and industry conferences, and works with them. It's not about having the campaign logo everywhere and things like that. It's more about how can you educate, engage, and raise more awareness around impact, and however it makes sense for your audience. Are you doing it through blogs? Are you doing it through interviews? Are you doing it yourself with education, discussions? This knowledge needs to continue to be shared. And then more so than anything, just before COVID hit in, we were starting to say to the events, it's wonderful that you're now creating platforms for conversation and connecting and knowledge share and communities around impact. But let's look at what you're doing with your building and your carpets and your cups and, you know, your whole structure. And you say to them, don't be overwhelmed. I was in events. I know how it goes. I used to say to my team, oh my God, we need an extra 20 mirrors, buy them and bin them. If we can't get the delivery guy here quick enough, you know, and the delivery would say, well, we need a 4-hour window and we'll charge you $1,000 if you're not there on the street when we come. I know we were a part of that problem. You were doing whatever you could to perpetuate making something to be successful in that moment. And so as we've now seen, COVID has all pushed us to different extremes and plans of where we wanted to be. But on that side, with events, I'm hoping it also is going to accelerate so many of our plans on what we need to do around sustainable development and impact. Yes, there's a lot of digitalization going on. I think that's incredible. I think technology is fantastic, but it can never replace what we need as humans. We are not wired to be completely removed from one another now. And I think it's really important that we now start working out in this time, what's next? What does impact mean to each of us? Because we all have so much influence and power, whether you're talking about impact around your dinner table, whether you're telling your employees, or whether you're just telling your neighbor. You've all got the ability to influence somebody. And to me, influence, it's just such a blah word these days because it just got picked up and become so commercial. But the reality is we all have the ability, I think more so, better word than influence, is to inspire, educate and aspire people to do better.
Thank you. For me, when I first went into Parliament, I was the first person that went on the mentoring scheme that I went on that has come from the fashion industry. They choose women, it's called the Fabian Women's Network, and someone approached me to apply because I was so disheartened by the way that politics was going in this country, and I really threw myself into it, and it was really eye-opening to meet women who were consciously ambitious, who expressed it, I felt in the fashion industry, my experience of it was we were all really ambitious, but we would all like have this kind of like, oh, it just happened. It did not just happen, honey. We were on that phone. We were doing that thing. We were, you know, I was in labour working. So I cannot emphasize enough how hard I worked. But we all had to also look fabulous and amazing and like, oh, it just happened, you know. And finally, I met people who were talking about their drive and their ambitions, and lots of them wanted to be MPs. And I even thought that that was what I wanted at that stage. And then I worked in Parliament, and I don't know that that's the best place for me to work 24/7, but doing the APPGs and realising that when I got there, that fashion didn't have a voice in Parliament enough for the level of value. And I see it again and again in policy. Heather, our policy researcher, is writing 3 letters as we speak to government about issues that have come up in the Chancellor's speech this week, and how they impact or don't give enough support to the fashion industry. And we see this again and again and again, that it's touted for the events and for the value and the gloss, but it's not necessarily embedded into policy. And during COVID, we could see that from the lack of pay parity to all of us. Whether if you're a company director paying yourself a dividend, you didn't get any help. If you weren't over 50k, you didn't get any help. But if you were on PAYE, which most of people in this sector aren't, you got help, whatever your income. So, you know, it's been really interesting for us to be able to kick. And I also feel like, I think all 3 of you do, that whatever I'm doing, I'm like, oh, this is my first time doing this, and I'm challenging myself. And I think that's what I want to share with all of us as well, is that we're always opening new doors and trying to work it out as we go along, or doing the call from the phone or the holiday with the baby crying. And I also want to share, and I know I shared with you last night, is for me, what really radicalized me was having a baby and realizing quite how difficult it was with a young baby to succeed in a sector that didn't allow me the job security, because I was a stylist, to continue and just justify very, very expensive childcare costs in London. And I think what's inspiring is that we've actually, out of that arc, we found new ways of doing business that maybe aren't where we would have gone before. I don't know whether that's true for you guys, but for me, that definitely was very relevant to where I was like, hang on a minute, this cost me £60 and that was cheap to send him to nursery, but I'm expected to do loads of free editorial to keep my place. And I'm sorry, but I can't justify spending 3,500, thousands a year to do free editorial to prop up a career that's then to do high street campaigns. I don't know, it just made me really think about things in a different way. And I also felt that I went through a time where I was very confused about it, because I tried to be the old Tamara. I had no flat shoes when I got pregnant, by the way. I mean, I was always in a 4-inch heel. I was known for it. And, and I had to buy them. I was horrified. I think I cried when I saw these horrible flat shoes, horrible. And we change so much, don't we, with those arcs and those journeys and those highs and lows. And I think that that's what I want to encourage in this conversation, is that it's not always like this. And COVID definitely has done this to us. Brexit's done this to us. Sustainability awareness has done this to us. But I hope that all of us are finding ways to just embed a sense of community, but because that's got to be core to what we do going forwards, because we've got to connect with the guy in Bangladesh who's now heavily in debt, Mustafiz Udin, and other factory owners, and the guy we heard yesterday called Mick, who's in Leicester, who can't, is having massive problems. And that's why we shared the Labour Behind the Label report, because it's so valuable for us as different people in different parts of the sector to really get to connect with those stories, because otherwise they can feel quite removed, can't they? And the first campaign I ever shot was for Topshop, Jane.
No, yeah. My God.
Yes, it was the early days of it, when it was Hussein Chalayan and Sarah.
Yeah. I know, I remember that very well.
I was so excited to be part of that. And I think none of us should knock where we've come from, is what I'm trying to say, because we can all feel a bit like, oh God, we worked on, with high street. I mean, in the UK, there wasn't other market to work with than the high street. As a stylist, it was in Paris that I could work with designers, whereas here they didn't have any money. So I think it's got to be something that we can carry, but we've reevaluated probably. And I also wanted to say that, Jane, we've had someone ask if they could get in touch with you. I'm happy to have them email us at admin@fashionroundtable.co.uk.
So no, please give my email. That's fine.
Okay,
No problem.
fine. So take them. We can share. If you email us, we can share Jane's emails. The UN, Kerry, just before we go, how aware, because I've seen the issues with Parliament, how aware do you feel the UN is of embedding this into what they do, especially in a more isolated world with Brexit and with an isolationist American government, and actually lots of countries moving in that direction? How difficult do you think it is for them, Kerry, to embed, when we're talking about a global supply chain, embed their thinking, which is more collaboration than with...
It's a really interesting time, because I think even the UN right now are facing challenges and situations they've never gone through themselves. You know, we're seeing all the events that should have happened this year at the United Nations that had to get cancelled. There was women's, youth, oceans. United Nations General Assembly is, for the first time in 75 years, never going to be gathered like we know it. And I think in that, it's calling them all, not just the leaders, the workers, the management, the experts, the researchers, to now start rethinking and saying, okay, this is what we're mandated to do with in our programs, if it's environment, if it's UN Women, if it's UNICEF. But now they're going to have to probably look for the first time ever to internally collaborate. And instead of just having a mission, which they are working hard to do and no one's knocking that, but now, instead of looking for what they can do externally with partners to drive change, I think you're going to see a lot of intra-agencies now starting to cross-sector and say, hey, I've got this research from over here in environment, but we're realizing it actually applies over here to housing. And this is what's happening during COVID. And one thing I will say specific to fashion, we saw at the end of 2018 the launch of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, which created an internal reporting group of around 10 UN departments and agencies where they would start really sharing what's going on. And I think that now with COVID is accelerating where those conversations need to go, because each department has incredible resources, especially around data and education on what's going on. And that now also needs to be brought more to the forefront. You know, people on this call need to be able to access these reports and knowledge if they want it, because it can help. Why are you going to go and set up independent reports of your own R&D and spend money that you could maybe put into your team or hiring more people or into team education and training or even better wages? People don't know this stuff is out there. And so I really think that COVID has connected us on so many levels on showing us there are no boundaries, there are no divides. And now more than ever, no matter where you sit on the system, you cannot be ignorant to what is needed. And if you have the assets and resources, and I don't necessarily mean financial, I think data and knowledge and education is at some points in some areas more powerful than having a grant or some money. And so I think there's going to be huge change coming, especially towards the end of the year, on what that looks like, on how the UN will communicate internally, but also externally to welcome partners and also show the resources that are available.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, because if you've got resources that we could share in the newsletter that goes out on Tuesday, that would be really helpful, because it's so valuable to, I mean, you're right, they feel like the most important, they are the biggest of the big schools in my head anyway. We've got Parliament, then we've got the EU, and then the UN. It's like, whoa, that's you know, so it's definitely, there are ways to access these reports. I think they're public access, aren't they? So you can find them online.
Yeah, it's just like the URLs like this long.
Yeah.
And you go through the site and you can't find anything. And I say to them, I'm like, okay, listen, I'm trying to translate to the outside world what's going on here. I don't have 22 hours to read 3 reports. I wish I did, but we've got to make this more digestible and understandable, so that actually companies and individuals can action this change or interpret it and see, this is what I can do, whether it's in my home, my community, or my business. But time is never of a great essence.
I think that's been the same thing with lots of policy people. I've sat with policy leaders talking about issues. Obviously, we started with Brexit, and they would start talking about freedom of movement, and I'd say, right, have you ever done a carnet? Trust me, you don't want to do a carnet for Europe. You start doing that, you've lost the business, they're all going to move. And they're like, I said, look, well, we used to have to weigh the clothes and go to Petit France, and now you can do it digital, but it all costs money and it's all a hassle and no one wants to do it. And you do that and it's going to drive. And I sat there and somebody from another group said, oh, you've actually really done the job, because so many of these policy people have continually had a job in policy and then they move to different organizations. And they've never done a carnet. They have never thought with the customs and immigration about getting the clothes in and out of the country, or pretended to be going on holiday, or whatever other thing that who've done a job where they've had to carry clothes and said, oh, I just didn't know what to wear.
Oh, I've done that.
We've all done it. It's harrowing.
And suitcases of bags.
Oh, I just really couldn't make my mind up. Was one. Oh, he was with another woman and I had to leave quickly, was another, because why I went in and out of Canada in a day from America. I mean, literally, like, so I do recognize that having people who are from the sector speaking about the policies that will have impact on them is valuable. I know we need to wrap up now, and I'm sure that Jane also needs to get back on the road, and that her family have been incredibly understanding about her sister in a motorway car for an hour. My husband's down to the garden, not drilling, and the baby probably needs feeding. And I think that sums up what women in business juggle all the time. That yes, and there you are. And what we juggle, and we do it, and then we look like swans, and really we're paddling furiously. And I think the more that we celebrate that, and actually doing webinars, and we're seeing the reality of people, or seeing people on Newsnight speaking and having the baby come in and asking for biscuits or whatever, is showing that we're all real. And I think the more that we have that access, the better I think it will be for everybody. If Nika and Jane and also Kerry, who we've just asked, if you've got information that you'd like to share with our newsletter, that would be fantastic. And Tatum, if you just send us an email, we can forward that on to Jane and also to Nika. And I think it would be brilliant if they could make their URLs quicker and easier. What government do here, which is much easier, is the executive summary. And what the EAC report did, the Environment Audit Committee, is they gave it a great cover, and fashion people really took to it because it was gorgeous and pink. And I do think that sometimes they do need to understand we're a very visual sector. And that to work with this and to highlight the value, but also connect with us in ways we communicate, is also a value to them as much as it is to us.
Oh, agreed.
Have a lovely afternoon, everybody. Enjoy your weekend away. Enjoy your holiday, Nika. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.